Can a censor studio break through the wall of the ordinary? In the early morning of May 16, 1961, an event occurred that changed the history of the Republic of Korea. The impact of this continues to this day. This event is called the May 16 military coup. But what if this May 16 military coup had failed? How would the history of Korea have unfolded? Let's take a look together. First, before we begin, let's review the situation in the Republic of Korea at that time. We need this context. What happened in April 1960, a social revolution, right? That's correct. On April 19, 1960, a social revolution broke out, and President Lee Sung-man was forced to resign. After that, Korea faced unprecedented chaos. In June 1960, a constitutional amendment shifted the country from a presidential to a parliamentary cabinet system. Following this change, the National Assembly dissolved itself. Afterward, the Democratic Party won a decisive victory, securing 75% of the seats. However, a problem emerged. At that time, the Democratic Party was split into old and new factions. President Yoon Bo-seon led the old faction, and Prime Minister Jang Mi-yeon headed the new. The factions clashed intensely over cabinet formation. After the Yang Mi-yeon cabinet was launched, there were 3 cabinet reshuffles in just 10 months. This shows how severe the political conflict was. At that time, the average term of a minister in the Yang Mi-yeon cabinet was only 2 months. Because of this, they couldn't really accomplish anything. As political instability continued, social unrest naturally followed. The demands that had been suppressed for over 10 years under the Syngman Rhee administration began to pour out like a flood. Every day was a protest. During the 10 months of the Yang Mi-yeon cabinet, there were about 2,000 street protests in total, and it is estimated that over 1 million people participated. If you do the math, that's an average of 7 to 8 protests every day. Let me tell you what happened. At school, students protested to stop their teachers from being transferred to other schools. At the Army Training Center, trainees protested because officers treated them disrespectfully. There were even cases where people protested against the protests themselves, demanding that the demonstrations stop. After the Syngman Rhee government collapsed, many media outlets emerged. Previously, there were 41 daily newspapers, but after the Syngman Rhee government collapsed in April 1960, the number increased to a total of 390 by the end of December 1960. But these media outlets kept encouraging protests. It was total chaos, really a complete mess. What happened in that situation was the May 16 military coup. But what would have happened if the May 16 coup had failed? The first thing that comes to mind is that the leaders of the coup would have been punished. There were quite a lot of people involved in leading the coup at the time. Even the Marine Corps took part. So many groups participated that you might be surprised to hear some of the names involved. Many notable figures participated then, including Park Chung-hee, future president, Kim Jong-pil, key to the 3 Kims era, Kim Young-wook, Cha Ji-chul, Choi Myung-shin, and Kim Shin. If the coup had failed, they would have been arrested and punished right away. The main leaders would have faced the death penalty, while participants would have received at least 5 years in prison. Since executions were carried out then, Park Chung-hee likely would have been executed. Also, the government would have continued the military purge. At that time, Prime Minister Chang Mi-yeon was targeting the military for purging and reform. He had proposed a plan to reduce the military by 100,000 troops as an election pledge, and after coming to power, he actually implemented policies to reduce the size of the military. The United States intervened and opposed the plan, so they couldn't cut 100,000 troops, but did reduce the military by 30,000 and made major leadership changes. In 10 months, the Minister of National Defense changed 3 times, and the Army Chief of Staff 4 times, reflecting frequent military leadership reshuffles. However, the cause was different. Right before the outbreak of the Korean War, the size of the South Korean military was less than 100,000, about 95,000 troops, but by the 1960s, that number surged to 700,000. Due to the rapid rise in soldiers, the organization became bloated, personnel appointments backlogged, and the 6th and 8th graduating classes complained. But when the military carried out a coup like this, Prime Minister Chang Mi-yeon saw it as a golden opportunity. He thought he could use this as an excuse to push his military downsizing policy even harder. They could also remove dissatisfied people in the military and purge them, so I think the military would experience purges for some time. They likely tried to ease the personnel bottleneck, and with Korean politics more chaotic, North Korea probably used this for propaganda and continued their two-faced tactics of appeasement and aggression. They called for peaceful reunification, but then acted provocatively. In the 1960s, there were many sporadic battles, both large and small, in the demilitarized zone. Without the coup, wouldn't Prime Minister Jang Mi-yeon have gained even more power by last year? As I mentioned earlier, the Democratic Party was then split between new and old factions, with intense political conflict, so it's clear they would have argued over who did more to suppress the coup. And in March 1961, the United States was predicting that given the situation in Korea, the Yang Mi-yeon government would collapse soon. And the United States States had already anticipated the May 16 military coup. Even if a military coup did not occur, they believed the Jangmyeon cabinet would collapse due to other issues, so the Jangmyeon cabinet probably would have fallen for some reason anyway. The administration wouldn't have switched parties, and someone else in the Democratic Party would have taken over, causing ongoing turmoil within the party. As a result, political instability would have increased, and I think economic development might have become harder. The 5-year economic development plan implemented under Park Chung-hee was originally proposed by the Jangmyeon cabinet. However, I doubt they could have carried it out as effectively as Park Chung-hee did. The 5-year economic development plan succeeded due to the strong charisma and bulldozer-like leadership of President Park Chung-hee and his administration. Because of this, successfully completing the 5-year economic development plan in such political and social chaos would have been extremely difficult, though they might have shown some results. With democracy thriving, pushing economic policies without considering workers' opinions would have been very difficult. For example, Nurse Gyeongbu, who ground the meat, couldn't have worked 12-hour shifts, cleaned bodies, and embalmed. If making workers act like machines broke the Labor Standards Act, they wouldn't have done it. So we're curious about something. Would the miracle on the Han River have occurred without President Park Chung-hee? We might not have become a top 10 economy, but I believe we could have grown enough to rank between 22nd and 30th. At that time, it was the Cold War era, and Korea was located at the front line of the Cold War, so there was quite a lot of aid coming from the United States. Also, we had more abundant human resources than people might think. That's why the Jangmyeon cabinet could have achieved some level of economic development, but as I explained earlier, since society and politics were unstable, this would have held back economic development. Also, since they didn't have as much drive as the Park Chung-hee administration, I think it would have been difficult to reach the level of advanced countries, but I think reaching the level of a middle power would have been possible. And above all, the decisive reason why South Korea's economic development could succeed was the Gyeongbu Expressway. But the construction of the Gyeongbu Expressway was absolutely due to President Park Chung-hee's role. In fact, it was President Park Chung-hee who first proposed building the Gyeongbu Expressway. Even the experts at the time were all against building the Gyeongbu Expressway because while they agreed that Korea's road conditions needed improvement, they said there was no need for such a large-scale expressway construction. In fact, if you look at the situation at the time, there weren't even many cars. In 1967, the total number of vehicles in South Korea was only 60,000, and by 1969, only 8% of the roads were paved. Given the economic situation, building the Gyeongbu Expressway wasn't urgent. It was the nation's biggest infrastructure project, so who would invest so much when funds were lacking? At that time, hardly anyone knew the word expressway. Still, the Park Chung-hee administration pressed on with its unique drive, which, as you know, was a huge success. The Gyeongbu Expressway became a decisive turning point that shifted South Korea's transportation system and freight distribution from being centered on railroads to focusing on road transportation. In the early days after it opened, the daily traffic volume was less than 20,000 vehicles, but by 1977 it had surpassed 30,000 and it continued to increase rapidly, along with the rise in the number of cars owned in the country. Until the end of 1971, more private passenger cars than trucks used the road, leading some to mockingly call it a tourist road. But as the expressway network grew, truck and freight traffic increased. It became the backbone of the economy, leading to successful growth. But I wonder if this outcome was inevitable. The failure of the May 16 coup didn't mean everything was bad. At that time, Jangmyeon. If you look closely at one of the main economic goals of the cabinet, it was gradual economic development centered on agriculture and the local economy. But if you look at it broadly, this was about balanced regional development. The capital area's concentration is so extreme, it's called the Seoul Republic. This ongoing problem in Korea stems from economic policies dating back to the Park Chung-hee administration. These problems could have been partially resolved, leading to a healthier economic structure with better income distribution and balanced development. Looking at politics, even now, they would probably still be insisting on the parliamentary cabinet system. If you look at the reason why the parliamentary cabinet system collapsed, it was because of the May 16 military coup. But since the May 16 military coup failed, they would have continued to maintain the parliamentary cabinet system. We might now live in a parliamentary cabinet system country like Japan or the United Kingdom. And I think democracy would have developed even further. If the rise of the military regime had been prevented, we could have achieved civilian-led democratic development. For example, various forms of philanthropy would have developed more than they have now, and labor rights would have been guaranteed much more robustly. Of course, social and political instability would have continued, but it probably wouldn't have lasted for 10 or 50 years. So, at some point, parliamentary-centered democracy would have taken root, and there is a high possibility that party politics and freedom of the press would have developed much more than they have now. Of course, it's true that President Park Chung-hee was a president with very clear strengths and weaknesses. Because of that, if President Park Chung-hee had not existed, I think the fate of South Korea would have been quite different. What do you think would have happened if the May 16 military coup had failed? Please let me know in the comments. That's it for this video. Bye!